Folks, welcome today to the webinar for the launch of Greg's book, The Physics of Project Acceleration. Glad I didn't screw the intro of the name of the book up. Today we're going to do a little bit of Greg and I talking about the book, a little bit of Q&A, and then we want to answer all the questions that you have. Some of you have gotten pre-release copies, so you may have some Q&A. Some of you have gone and pre-ordered the book, and it's getting out to you in the mail today, so we're super excited for that. So, Greg, let me tell you a little quick story about Greg. The one time we hung out and he spent the night in prison. I'm just kidding. Greg is the CEO of Nodes and Links. I've known Greg for several years now. Greg has always had a passion for project delivery and really breaking down the science behind project delivery and formulate it in ways that people can understand. And I think those are invaluable nuggets and pieces of information that people get to take into their projects and use on a day-to-day basis. And so Greg wrote this book, and we're going to dive all into it. But before we kick things off, is there anything that you want to bring to the crowd and tell them about your book or your company before we really get rocking and rolling?
Well, I think in the company, we've already decided what the next book's going to be, and lo and behold, it's most likely going to be how to successfully deploy artificial intelligence into project controls organizations. I'll think of a snazzier title. What I'd say
that's a working title.
We'll work on that. Yeah, exactly. But what I'd say is if people are interested in having AI tech for scheduling, go check out Nodes and Links. That's the day job and allows us to pay for things like books. Other than that, I'm good to jump in.
Awesome. So let's just jump right in. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Micah Piippo. I am the CEO of Movr US. Background for me is I've been in construction for about 15 years, most of them scheduling. I've built a ton of weird different projects, and then years ago I landed at Google in about 2014 and spent about 8 years building their planning and scheduling program on the data center side. And I also co-host Beyond Deadlines with Greg. But that's a little bit about me. Let's get into this. So the book, Physics of Project Acceleration, out of everything you could tackle, why acceleration?
There's a couple of things to this. What I'd say is, number one is, I never actually intended to write this book. We're genuinely here by accident today. So the day job, we make artificial intelligence, and one of the things that we were trying to do is to figure out how to train AI to find acceleration opportunities on projects. We realized that there was no good literature, and by good literature, I mean a formula or a recipe for accelerating projects. So, these are things you do, this is how you do it, that an AI can ingest and then start to apply. So I actually started writing it for that purpose. It was internal. Getting into it, I actually realized that there's so much that the community hasn't defined yet. So 8 types of acceleration. No one's ever talked to me about 8 different types of acceleration and 33 acceleration techniques. No one's ever listed 33 acceleration techniques to me. It just hit, and it actually hit both of us because you're one of the people who taught me into writing it into a book, that it'd just be really, really useful to a lot of people. And not to give too long answer, but you and I have 2 philosophies. Philosophy number 1 is give away all of the secrets, and then if people need help with implementation, they'll probably give you a call, which is a very different business model and philosophy. And the second is throw everything into creating amazing content, and if you're useful, people will have a bit of goodwill and will give you a shot. That's really Beyond Deadlines is about, the book's about all of this. So long story short, it wasn't an objective I was trying to solve. It was a wandering walk. And now I guess the goal, if we're defining it, is to enable people to have massive impact on their projects through classification of what acceleration is, and basically create a cookbook that people can just open and use when they need a project to go faster.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, one of our taglines, Beyond Deadlines, is tactics you can use right away. And I think me going through the book, there's a lot there that you can use right away. I mean, we're gonna, actually, let's just get right down to the nitty gritty. Let's get into the details. People probably came in here and are like, how do you accelerate a project? So why don't you tell us just high level summary, 8 types of acceleration. What are we talking about here? I bet most people are familiar with like path crashing. Most people are probably
Hmm.
familiar with overtime. Most people are probably familiar, with the the typical how do we make a project go faster. But let's just dive right in. Tell me about these 8 types.
So, well, if I was to do an overview, so there's 8 types of acceleration, and then there's 33 techniques of how to actually do acceleration. And the 8 types of acceleration is just because projects are really messy and weird. So you get 8 because of 2 times 2 times 2. And I've simplified the world, but the first 2
I'm glad you did
is,
that math for me because I can't.
yeah, well, you could have got 8 from 4 times 2 or 16 divided by 2. I don't know. You
There's square root
the
there
8
somewhere.
I don't know what a square root is. Okay, so you get the 2 times 2 times 2. The first 2 is, are you trying to accelerate a single milestone or many milestones? Because if you said to me on a project, I just want the end date to move forward as fast as possible, how I go about it would be very different than if you said, here's 10 milestones and I want all 10 of them to come back and I'm going to weight them like this so that sometimes maybe it's good to get 9 back and extend one. And you can see how it can get complicated.
Yeah.
So number
Let
one
me
is,
ask
are
you
you
let me ask you
tackle?
a quick question on that one. On
Yeah.
this one, does it matter if it is the end milestone or just a milestone, right? Because sometimes you have like a dozen. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's how you want to define it. It's just if you want it to, it's about how you weight it in that. So your end milestone might be weighted 80%, and you've got another 10 milestones at 20%. But it's how you do the math. So the first part, that's the part. Are you going for one or many? The second part is, are you considering just the critical or the longest paths getting there, or are you considering all paths? All paths basically just being productivity. So if I was, how would this originate on site is, the critical path is everybody who's not involved in the critical path move out of the way. The people doing the critical path come first. The opposite is, if I'm trying to optimize for productivity, I'm just wanting as much utilization of people and assets, irrelevant of what activity it is, so long as it's within a bunch. So you've got those. And then the third is just a quirk of the world of maths, which is, are you just looking at the world like it's deterministic and fixed, or are you considering variability, which in scheduling world is where you bring in Monte Carlos and simulation engines and all of this kind of stuff. So you've got 8 types of acceleration because of how those two all combine.
Yeah. And boy, did you just open up a can of worms that I'm not thinking you wish you had. Okay. So you brought up predictability.
Mm-hmm.
I want to kind of slam into that really quick. You talk a bit about your book about how there's a relationship between predictability and acceleration. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit more? I think you talk about it maybe as being like a hidden accelerator or something that people don't necessarily think about. And when you're talking right there, my little scheduler spidey senses went off because you're like predictability or productivity. Now I'm using those interchangeably, I guess, right now. Let's focus on
Yeah.
predictability
Yeah,
first, and
they're
then
not the same. They're related. So predictability is the relative of acceleration, but they're not the same thing, and they're
you're
also
gonna
not
be
completely
using
separate.
camera words for me. What do you mean relative acceleration? It's the
Actually,
cousin you want to
predictability,
show up for Christmas, or it's the cousin you don't want to show up for Christmas?
generally yes, but they can be annoying.
All right, fair enough.
So both acceleration and predictability are terms from physics. They mean very, very specific things in physics. So acceleration is part of Newtonian mathematics, and it means the rate of change of speed over time. And predictability is actually associated with confidence levels in measurement results. So you don't need to know it. They mean very specific things. On a project, acceleration and predictability are very, very closely linked because they touch a lot of the same principles. So they touch uncertainty, risk, path events, and system information like calendar events, constraints, these kinds of things. Where they're very similar is that you can have acceleration techniques that positively impact predictability. So, for example, long tail slicing, where you're trying to eliminate the things that have a high potential of exploding in duration. So that would both improve acceleration and it would improve predictability. But there are things as well where acceleration and predictability don't go together. So on the other side, with acceleration, you want to create the possibility of going faster, which increases volatility, which decreases predictability. So now it depends on what exact type of predictability, but we're getting into semantics there. Basically, they're incredibly related, but they're not exact, because you can have things where you accelerate and increase predictability, but you can also have things where you accelerate and massively decrease predictability.
Yeah, I would think the latter is more based on my experience, where you don't have a high degree of predictability in project delivery because we are actually late on a project and now we're trying to accelerate to catch back up. And you're actually, to doing those sorts of steps, you are increasing your risk of late delivery. Okay, we tackled P number one. Let's go to P number two, productivity. Productivity, you mentioned in your initial, was like increasing, the amount of work fronts available and things like that. Some people would argue that maybe that's not great productivity. You're actually going to have reduced productivity because it's not as focused. And I know you're giving an example of something else, but can you walk us through a little bit about how productivity plays into acceleration, and maybe what are some kind of good or bad or high risk, low risk types of productivity?
Yeah, well, to dive into that, I'll just give a super high level summary of what the book's about. So I describe what acceleration is in physics, then I describe acceleration in projects, and it goes to the 8 types of acceleration. It describes how you actually measure each of the 8 types with different graphs, so what graphs you need to measure. And then I open up the acceleration equation, which is just a very simple 4-part equation that mathematically describes everything that impacts acceleration in project schedules. And then in each of those 4 parts, I break it down into all the techniques, which is where you get the 33 from. Now, productivity is just it's directly one of those techniques, and it influences a couple of others. But what I'd say, and that's it, under resource availability, if you can increase effective production, and I mean effective production, people turning up for work is not effective production. Effective production is when people turn up for work and they have the job cards and the tools ready and they know exactly what they're doing and there's no blockers and they actually start the work and they hit the minimum level of productivity and they're delivering. So it's quite a few things. That is a positive thing for acceleration, but it's only a positive thing if you can do other things like path crashing. So if you can bring things forward, because, for example, if you have a team that works amazingly well and gets 5 days worth of work done in 3 days, but you have a fixed contract and the next team doesn't come in till Monday, you can't accelerate on a critical path. So there's all of these little subtleties to it. And one of the hardest things in actually writing this book was actually making it as simple as possible. It was pulling it out. Now, I think I did a pretty good job about making it simple, but there's some very, very specific logic to this. I'm going to jump in there as well. There's something I want to say, which is actually the most important part. When I thought about fundamentally addressing acceleration, I had to fundamentally think about the unspoken philosophies that we use to do scheduling and project management. So just a few real truths about the world, which might make you smile. I've said some of these to you before, but number one is that real world acceleration, so real world project acceleration, isn't possible. It's an impossible thing. Now that might sound surprising by a guy who's just written a book on project acceleration, but hear me out.
Do you take refunds? Do I need my receipt?
Bear with me. So when Einstein wrote the general theory of relativity, he coined something saying everything is relative. Now, what he actually meant by that is that there's an assumption within the heart of physics that there's no centralized frame to the universe, which means that physics works here just as well as it works in the middle of the sun, just as well as it works on the outer of the solar system, and that there's no central point. Everything. Now, one of the examples he gave is, if I drop a ball, how do I know it's falling? You have to have something to compare it against. So, like a wall or a planet or something. So everything is relative. Things only fall compared to other things. It's the same here. So it's, okay, how do we accelerate a project? Well, if we were being perfect scientists, we would have an identical project exactly in the same environmental conditions. Think of an electron. I get an electron in the same place in CERN, accelerate it to the same voltage, and see the output. And then I do it a second time, and I do it again. The problem is you can't do that with projects. Projects are unique endeavors, so you can't perfectly compare projects. They never have the same physical concepts. And the same thing is projects are not under the laws of physics, they're under the laws of society, which means that there's no physical law that says that production of welding is this number. It's whatever a bunch of people decide it is. So the unwritten secret of projects is that to make all of this understandable and make it so that we can actually do something, what we do is we all secretly agree that the model that we build is reflective of reality. So the model that we build is the schedule, which is based on critical path scheduling, and the cost plan, which is based on an Excel that we've built, and the engineering design, which is based on a bunch of specs and drawings that we've built. And we all agree that that's how we think the world works. Now you can accelerate that thing. So what the book truly is all of the mathematical techniques you can use to change the schedule model that the whole of the Western world has agreed truly represents reality and therefore tells us if we've accelerated. I got very philosophical then, but it's actually a very important,
Yeah, I just want to know that one guy who was like hitting the refund button if you actually stopped him from hitting the refund button. I believe you did. Wait, okay, I hear you on that one. Let me ask you a kind of simple but probably complex question then. If it's us just changing, this sort of model as you say it, is acceleration hard?
yes, is the, well, okay, so yes and no. Figuring how to accelerate is incredibly easy. Doing it is incredibly hard. And what I mean by that is, in the vast number of projects that I've dealt with, people have a reverse view of how you go about acceleration. And this is just a mindset. So people will think about what's possible and then they'll go and do it. And actually, if you accept that what we're trying to do is some maths on a model, doing a lot of maths using 33 techniques instead of one or two, nowadays with AI and nowadays with cloud computing is incredibly easy. So you can get a list. Figuring out how you would accelerate a specific project is very easy. Taking that and figuring out if those things are possible and then convincing teams to execute them, that is unbelievably difficult. And that's what you pay project managers and project schedulers and project controllers vast sums of money to do.
Yeah, I definitely feel the actual acceleration is either there's like two different sorts of situations I always land in. Right. One, I'm asked to accelerate something that I know cannot be accelerated. I'm like, it's just not physically possible, or it's because of the productivity, the probability is so low. The second one is we have the possibility to accelerate. However, you know, corporate culture, governance, whatever, you can't get approval or whatever to go take care of it and do it. That's like kind of the two buckets I always think.
So this is where you and I have had many conversations over the years, and I agree with it. So, I'm in a very fortunate position. I was able to get a good education. I was able to have good mentors. I was able to, go out and start a company. I was lucky enough that it was successful. And underneath all of that, the thing that I've found, the two things I've found have stood me really in good stead. Number one is learning advanced methods of thinking. And it's nothing to do with intelligence or IQ. It's literally techniques of thinking. So for example, thinking about the philosophy of what scheduling and project management is just a process. It's just a skill. It's nothing truly special in it. And then second is the mentors that have guided me that way. Really, as I went through the book, the topic is project acceleration. The thing that I enjoyed the most was actually inserting all of a number of different techniques of advanced thinking. So, for example, reversing the philosophy of figuring out what's practical and then analyzing impact to doing large sums of math to analyze impact and then figuring out from the best options what's possible. Or in this sense, framework thinking, where you've bucketed it, where you've said, I've got a culture that, well, I know a project can't be accelerated, but someone's asking me to. And then versus, I know a project can be accelerated, but a culture's blocking the way. It's like these kinds of things. The feedback that I really want to hear from people is actually how they enjoy the thinking.
Yeah, we don't want to hear about your company culture. We know it's I'm just kidding. We want to hear those stories as well too. But yeah, definitely I would love to hear some when people get the book and they start diving into some of these techniques and they start trying to utilize them. What sort of rocks and other things are they able to uncover by checking different sorts of strategies that they may not have ever thought of, right? One of mine that I'm starting to deploy more and more is the long tail slicing, because I'm usually working more on front end of projects. And that one to me is a pretty brilliant way to start attacking some of the bigger risks or some of the bigger delays, But I got a question for you that just came to my mind. What do you think right now, if you think about the industry and acceleration in writing your book and coming up with these models, what do you think is one of the biggest myths or falsehoods that exists today with acceleration?
The biggest myth is it's not about maths. Like, if we all agree that acceleration is going to be measured against some model that we've invented out of thin air, which we call a baseline, and the actuals that we're putting into it, then it really is a maths question. And the difficulty I actually see on a vast number of projects around the world is that they don't combine people who are very highly skilled at maths, and not simple maths, I mean like quadratic equations and these kinds of things, with people who are very highly skilled at system and emotional intelligence, which are generally project managers. Now, there's 5 kinds of intelligence. IQ is just one of them. And then they don't put those people together with a recipe book and a framework for how to accelerate. So if you think about it, if acceleration really is mathematical, and then there's a practical component, if you don't have someone who can do the maths, you're massively limited on the options and measuring if it actually worked. If you don't have a framework, there's no structured way to think about which acceleration techniques you want to use. And if you don't have an incredibly capable project manager of some kind, you can't implement anything. And actually, like as I describe it, it makes obvious sense. You require all 3 of these things to have the best acceleration capability. But I've actually never seen an organization that has all 3 of those. It's always a mix, maybe, of 2 of them.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't really, I guess, probably people don't think like budgets aren't, completely endless. And so they're trying to fit in the exact pieces. And I think people don't think about this in the right way. In today's organizations, I think people are still very role-based in how they want to attack projects.
Mm-hmm.
They think about a project manager and a scheduler and a cost analyst, and they don't think about, what are the sorts of problems I'm actually going to have to solve and how am I going to solve them? They just think that a project manager will solve that problem or a scheduler will solve that problem, and it's not always necessarily the case. And then, for large organizations that are continually building similar styles or types of projects, they also aren't attacking probably from a situational problem-based approach and still are just overloading on a role-based approach, which I think could be an actual game changer if you really focused a large organization that was building multiple projects and you really wanted to focus on acceleration. You probably need to have an acceleration type-based team that has the ability to work across the org and attack different functions, because I've only seen it done in like name, and then when they actually go to say like, hey, if we switch these foundations or did this, the actual org that controlled it is like, we're not doing that, and then they like just peter away into OKR and goal and ether and go find something else to do.
By the way, these organizations have existed before, just not in project management. So like Formula One pit stop teams are that, and NASCAR teams. So it's like they want to get faster at pit stops. So it's like, okay, what do? They will have someone or a group of people who are only responsible for acceleration, and they will be using maths. They'll be timing everything. They'll be seeing how long things take. They'll be measuring variability. It's a different set of techniques, but this is not new thinking. It's only new in that it's for the project context. By the way, I see we've got a hand up, Micah. Can you see the hand up?
Not from, I don't think I'm as important as you.
Well, I can see a hand up, but I can't see the question now. I'll leave it to Brooke. Brooke can tell us.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions, but we have one hand up from Vishal. Vishal, I think you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question.
I wonder if he had it like me, where you have a great question and the time goes by.
Hi guys,
Hey.
Vishal
Hey,
here.
Vishal.
Yeah, I mean, so far I'm getting to learn a lot from your insights and all. And yeah, the one question that hit me was right off the bat, mainly was like how acceleration is going to impact on budgets and cost overruns on a financial perspective. Could you speak much on about that? How the acceleration?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, I'll take this from the top. I'll give you the short answer, which is it depends. Some acceleration you have to pay money for, some acceleration makes you money, some acceleration doesn't cost you anything. It depends fundamentally based on three things, which is whether or not you're measuring cost against some, again, imaginary baseline we've come up with versus what an actual outturn would have been, whether or not you're measuring drawing down on risk because you're increasing some kind of certainty or acceleration there, and where the boundaries of the projects lie. It varies between everything because it depends on how you set up the contract. So I'll give you an example. How can one that Micah mentioned before? How can you accelerate by enabling weekend working and these kinds of things? Well, weekend working is going to cost you because you're going to have to pay overtime for people. You're also going to have contracts in place. If you're in an environment with a heavy unionized workforce, that's going to cost you a lot of money. But if you are able to pull milestones and tasks forward, then that can be an acceleration option. Another one that doesn't cost you anything and actually saves you costs is if you do scope exclusion. So if you do task removal, so if you're able just to carve scope out of the project and say, we're just not doing that in this project, let's leave that, that cuts budgets. So what I'd say is in the process of thinking about this, you have to take a very linear logic approach. So you have to say, what type of acceleration am I trying to achieve? What are my options for accelerating? Which are the techniques? How much impact do they have? And then assuming I can do them, what would the cost implication be to do that acceleration technique? And only at that point can you do the whole graph and figuring out on the efficient horizon which ones you'd want to do.
Yeah, the other one I would add is I see missed a lot strategically is most cost estimates are done on a percentage of cost of work basis. We want to have 20-30% contingency, but very rarely do they assess whether, okay, we have this broad-based contingency, but are we also going to need other things that happen during this project? Like, is there a chance that we'll accelerate this project? And so it kind of just gets lumped into that 20 and 30%. That 20 and 30% was meant for something else, essentially, right? And then you still have to go through the approvals of taking that contingency and getting your acceleration approved. So if you're earlier on in the project, you could lay this out in a more simple way and say, listen, we're actually going to strip out some of that contingency or add additional contingency, but it's going to be for project acceleration that's going to happen. And you kind of get it more pre-approved. That way there's probably less paperwork on the back end, of let me build this case to figure out if we can spend $5 million to pull it in. It's just, no, we got $5 million approved for acceleration. It's another line item and we can go utilize it when need be. And then also what that does is when you address it on the front end, then people are thinking of it as the project goes forward. It's something that they know they can use, that they can grasp if they want to, and people have that ideas of acceleration that are there because the math behind acceleration is super important, but people got to be bringing those acceleration ideas to the table, or else you're not going to be able to execute on them, regardless of the.
So I'm gonna take you there, Mike, and I'm gonna flip this thing around because when I had the brain fart, I remember when I first said, actually, I want to turn this into a book, and you read the first draft, and you came to me, and you were like, this, no, and then I rejigged it, and you were like, actually, that's pretty good. And then I was like, do you know what would really, really help is you putting examples of how you've accelerated throughout the whole book. And I'm openly happy saying this. Micah is better at practical project scheduling than I am. I am probably better, your opinion. I'm probably better at the mathematics and the theory. So my question there is, the book highlights some of the toughest moments for acceleration. Which of these stories is your favorite? Well, which one actually, still pops into your memory rent free?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you letting me share some of the stories. And if you go in and read the book, you'll very quickly realize it's called Micah's Milestones and Missteps, because I wanted to capture, there it is. Yeah. I wanted to capture different scenarios that happen. I mean, it's like, I don't want to write about this in this is, a perfect world where I just snap my fingers and great things, worked out. I think one of them that I highlight in the book, which I think you have a tactic on and as part of the formula, right? It's information. I think you call it. Is it system information? Yeah.
System information. It covers calendars, constraints, and other things.
Yeah, and it's something that gets highly overlooked. And this is going to seem fairly simple, but I was working on Google data centers and we're having issues with project and timing. And I went in and on some of the activities that the general contractor was using, they put on a specific calendar for them. And on others, they had another specific calendar. And I looked at the calendar and it was actually for a prison build in the same country. And it was like, I don't remember what the name of the prison was, but it was like, blah, 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 prison. I was like, that is, there's our issue. And it tipped off a bunch of other things, because if you're not paying attention to your calendars, like what else? And then security issues. But I think that one was one of the ones that it's just hilarious to me to this day that I go through and I was like, why is there a prison calendar on the project? And it also highlights how critical system information is, because it goes back to your model. Schedules are models. They're mathematical models. And that's one of the things why we do constraints and negative lags and different sorts of relationships that we should and shouldn't do. It's just to make the model behave in a way that we think it should behave. And when you're talking about acceleration, really understanding how the model was built really lets you know about what sort of answer you're getting out of it. And so I think it's something silly about the prison calendar, but it plays such a fundamental role. If your whole schedule is just built on the superintendent named Steve saying everything was 5 or 10 days, you're not going to get a great answer if you start asking it questions on acceleration. And so that was one. I think the other one was, there was one on crashing a schedule. So we crashed a schedule. I was working at Intel, and it was actually a very effective schedule crashing. I'd never really actually been a part of a really, really good schedule crashing session where lots of people come together and you're actually trying to figure out what can be done in parallel, what can be resequenced, what can be eliminated. And it was, everyone was kind of huddled in the room and we're all bringing ideas to the table. I'm sitting there working side by side with the GC schedulers, making sure that data is getting information in the system, we're getting it updated, we're being able to provide the project team answers. People are like on the phone, like, you got to get in here, answer this question now in the nicest way possible. So I'd say two of those definitely is like crashing a schedule, I think has a bad kind of vibe to it now based on, I think it's possible and I think it's awesome. And I love that idea. I also love just finding a prison schedule in my prison calendar in my schedule. I think those two that are constantly, I just come back to me.
This is why I thought it was so weird. Like, think about it. Why have none of the governing bodies just published a list of all of the techniques that you can use for acceleration? Like, if you want acceleration, go in and check calendars is one of them. Have you got, I don't know, by the way. I don't know. Like, why do you think no one's ever done that?
I think that, to me, there are different angles or different things that organizations cover. And when I think you start crossing over into acceleration, it ends up into more of like this is what we're doing. And this is tactics. Like, this is how you go do it. And I think most of the organizations cover the philosophical, like, why behind it. I think like how you go accelerate a project is very different than this is how a project charter should look. But it's just one of those ones where, I think it's a broad topic and it's hard to write about and it's hard to get the whole thing together. And so that's probably why most people haven't tackled it because well, what about this? What about that? What about this? And I think it takes a physicist approach to actually create a formula to start kind of containing down this is all the steps that could take.
All right. Well, that's where Brooks give me Brooke and Ben, who are on this part of the team, have been absolutely incredible. And the only reason the book exists actually is because of Brooke and Ben, because Brooke took all of my writings and all of my notes and even my pencil drawings and turned them all into actual proper diagrams and these kinds of things, and then made it a beautiful. It's amazing. Plus Monica as well on our team. But they've also done something else, which is for everyone who's actually pre-ordered a copy, which I was actually quite amazed is quite a lot of people. I never thought, I promised myself at university I'd never do two things, write a book and run a marathon, and now I've done one of them. I might as well start getting my running shoes on. But the other thing they've done is they forced me to record a 13-part video course where I spend 10 minutes per chapter actually going through all of the main stuff in the chapter and explaining it in as simple English as I possibly can, so that if people just want to flick through and then get a really good sense when they're walking their dog or they're driving into work in the morning, they can do. That is completely free to everyone and will be accessible after this session this evening. I don't know exactly when. Brooke will tell me. It comes back to that philosophy, which is give away all of the secrets totally for free, and then if somebody wants help with implementation because they find it incredibly useful, then maybe you'll call us one day. So that's something that I want to do a round of applause to Brooke for and the team, because I can't do that stuff. That's too much.
Well, tell me a little bit more about these videos so people have an idea what they're getting into. So these are where you're talking about little micro lessons. So you're going to go in and whatever we didn't cover on the call today, maybe some of the stuff we did touch on, you're just going to really go in and show the math behind path crashing.
Well, not the math. I don't show equations, but for example, if I go on page 184, that's every technique you can use to accelerate a project under the 4 areas. Okay. So in the videos, I'll go, right, uncertainty control. The first one is productivity alignment. I'll tell you exactly what this is. And I explain every single one and what it is and how you go about measuring it. But I try and be as simple as possible. So it takes you through the entire book in a summarized way, I guess.
Nice. Solid.
Okay, solid. So I'm thinking here that we flip it on its head, and we actually open up for anyone in the audience to ask any questions on the Q&A. So I think you click. There we go.
We have a few questions in here, so I'll read off the questions and I'll let you guys decide who is going to take it. So we're going to start off with Marcus. Oh, sorry. Marcus has a surprise dog. Marcus from Rio, from Brazil. Why do we have to accelerate something that was not planned to be optimal? So why don't we just do it right the first time?
Oh, okay. So that's a very good question. I'd love to answer from the theory side. Micah, you can answer the practical side. So, and I talk about this. So, a contract is a promise between people. It's not in the laws of nature. There's nothing in the laws of physics that say that the contract that you signed is exactly what should happen based on how electrons fly and based on how the sun shines. So it's a promise between people about what could happen. That promise is incredibly susceptible to biases and to incentives. So if people are massively incentivized to get something over the line, they may understate the risk or understate the cost or understate the time and these kinds of things. What I'd say is that is a different problem than I have a model and now whatever happened there happened. I now need to make this model go faster. And that's just the pure maths of it. So I'd say there's a hard divide between those two, between what I call soft science and hard science. Soft science is sociology, business management, elements of psychology, ecology and things. And hard science is mathematics, physics, chemistry, these kinds of things. And to be honest, physics is just applied mathematics. and a schedule model is an applied mathematic model of how we think the world works. So I'd say that I'd be like, they're two separate problems. These two.
Yeah. Well, I want to just clarify for Marcus. I don't think Greg's intent in writing this book is to say you have to accelerate your project. I'm not sure that's what you meant by your question, but I wanted to clarify that. What he's really trying to do, and I don't mean to speak for you, Greg, but is just provide you the tools in case you want to do it. And also, many of these tools aren't always necessarily acceleration techniques that come out as pure acceleration, but many of them are efficiency gains, productivity gains, building buffer into your schedule, which may not shift the end date of your project, but could make it less risky. And I mean, to kind of sum up what Greg said, to answer the actual questions, it's money. Projects get delivered on time. That earns the client or owner money to get whatever they got finished, started, and rolling. And then for the general contractor, and it costs them, the owner and client, less money if it's delivered on time because it's not late and they're not paying overheads and all that stuff. And then from the general contractor side, typically they earn something for delivering the project on time. And then there's less legal disputes, all that good stuff. So yeah, it really just comes down to dollar bills.
All right. I've got another question from Carter from Intel. He says, Greg, you mentioned in your book emergent forces in a project schedule, likening it to an iron spring. Reducing the uncertainty in that system, you mentioned, requires only knowledge that it works, not understanding. Is understanding the effects of emergent forces possibly an area you see as the next frontier of sorts, a scheduler, skills, knowledge, experience, or development?
Okay, that's a very good, deep question. Okay. So I'll need to take that apart for everyone. So I talk about in the book how a spring is springy, not because of a law of physics, but because of just statistics. It's weird stats. There are just more states for the atoms where they're curled than they are where they're stretched. So by the second law of thermodynamics, which is around entropy, which essentially is everything tends towards disorder, the spring just naturally wants to curl with vibration. If you freeze a spring and take it to 0 temperature, there is no springiness to it. The thing will just either not move or will snap. So what I'm trying to say with this is a spring, the force of a spring is not a real force of nature. It's what's known as a pseudo force of nature. It comes from statistics. Project management is part of the faculty of business management, which is obviously teaches MBAs and things like that. And business management is part of the soft sciences of university. And soft sciences are fundamentally focused on emergent phenomena, which essentially is correlation versus causation. So if an electron hits an atom, I can imply causation in some way. But if I change the culture of an organization and the performance increases, I can't say here is a causal equation of how that, it's a correlation. This happened and that also correlated to happen. Projects are of that nature. To answer Carter's question directly, there's a huge amount of research happening at the moment in like some of the top tier universities, so like MIT and Harvard and these kinds of things, around the emergent phenomena of project-based networks. And ultimately what it is learning how to change certain things such that they correlate with greater performance. It's doing it just to a much more detailed level than we've been able to do in the past because the level of data being captured today is much, much higher. But practically, there are actually some acceleration techniques that pull on those complex emergent phenomena where you don't actually need to understand the system. And by the way, physicists don't understand gravity. Nobody understands gravity. We don't know what it is, but we've got equations that tell us how it works. So actually it holds true. You don't need to know what something is to know how it generally works. And it's the same thing here. We don't need to know the emergent phenomena of projects. We just need to know stuff that works. And by the way, one of the acceleration techniques is about making things really simple. So stop having 65,000 critical paths, or simplify the schedule, make it more linear. And lo and behold, when you do that, it correlates with much less risk in the program. So very, very in-depth and hard question from Carter there. Good one.
I have another question. Do you obey in your book the sacred laws from the 1950s?
The sacred laws of what?
The sacred laws of CPM.
Yes, I do, but not directly. I do because I've just assumed that the critical path waterfall methods that we use in things like Primavera P6 and Microsoft Project hold true. What I haven't done is gone into the mathematics of critical path method, because, by the way, the mathematics are wrong, but it's right enough that it makes sense to do. So yes, the book is not a theoretical brain fart about, oh, wouldn't this be a cool theory to put out there? Again, coming back, tactics and strategies that people can use right away. The book just assumes that nothing, like that the world is the way the world is, and we're all using Primavera and we're all using Microsoft Project, and we all just need to get the job done and we need to accelerate this project by Thursday. Cool. What can I do? So under that guide, yeah, it follows the rule of CPM.
Yeah, I always find it weird when I first started that there was CPM specifications sitting there. Just like, CPM's an algorithm. Why are we writing a specification to it? I think, the approach that I prescribe to now is to broaden that. You're looking at a planning and scheduling approach, and that algorithm plays into it. And part of it, there is a lot more that we can talk about and discuss and really dive into outside of one algorithm.
Yeah, I agree. Like coming full circle, it's just strangely the method that everyone agreed represented reality. So everyone just assumes that that's the way it works. Now, it doesn't fully represent reality, but okay, who cares? If 20 million people believe it, we'll just go with it.
Awesome. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions to answer. So the next question is, what are the key metrics or KPIs which benchmarks this acceleration? Is there anything cost?
Go on, Micah.
Anything beyond time and cost? Yeah. I mean, well, so there's going to be beyond time and cost, but those are going to be, for example, team morale, safety, quality. That when you get beyond time and cost, those are the things that I write about. A story of mine where we finished a critical project milestone, but no one was really checking the quality of what was being done. And this happened on, countless projects I've worked on, where then you get a punch list, and it's actually not really a punch list. It's just more stuff that needs to be done, and these projects drag on for years and years and years. So I think beyond the metrics, it's quality, it's safety, and it's team morale. If you start out a project that's 3 months behind schedule and it's permanently behind schedule and bad, like that sucks the morale out of the team, and that can be measured, team survey and all that sort of things. So those are the areas I would check for on that. I mean, when you start looking at acceleration, I think you bring up a great point on metrics and KPIs that if you are going to accelerate a project, you should probably figure out how you're going to measure the success beforehand. And that can be done in a couple standard ways. You can either be measuring it off of the milestone, you can be measuring it off the cost you decided to spend, you can be measuring more near term off of activity starts and finishes and durations. If you're going the full EVM route, you can look at SPI and CPI and earn and make sure you're staying on that S curve of acceleration. Greg's book has many curves, probably the best curves that you can use to look at on time, late delivery, and really understand what those curves are telling you. So that's what I come up with metrics that are not time and cost related, and then just some of that standard buckets of metrics you could be using. Fundamentally, really, though, is just define your approach before you start to accelerate.
Well, you just said something that made me think that something that isn't in the book. So the book is just it's a cookbook that explains all the types of acceleration and all of the techniques you can use to accelerate. What it doesn't discuss at all is the cost of acceleration and should you accelerate. It's essentially giving people the ability to figure out how, but the should we do it is a separate question. That's really where project experience comes in. I won't name, but there are projects in the world and countries in the world where they have much less requirements around people safety compared to some other countries. And they leverage that to accelerate the project so that they're done faster and cheaper, but at the cost. And it's like, okay, well, should you do that? It's a personal view. Brooke, last one?
Yep. Okay, we have one more question, and this is from Lee Whedon. Are you referring to acceleration in the true sense of increased speed, or are you talking about pushing more more throughput through the system?
Very, very, very good question. So yeah, this is where I've bastardized from physics. So the very definition of acceleration in physics is the double differential of position over time, which essentially means the rate of change of speed. So if your speed isn't changing, it is not acceleration. If you're driving down the motorway at 100 miles an hour, that's not acceleration, that's just speed. Projects don't work quite like that, because if we have an S-curve and we're doing that and the baseline says this, people would say we're accelerating. If a physicist look at that, and I did have my roommate from university who's a lecturer in astrophysics in London now have a look at it, and he really took umbrance with this. He was like, projects would call that acceleration. He was like, that's not acceleration. There is no change to the second gradient. Rather than stand on ceremony, I just said, look, pulling away from the baseline, we'll call it acceleration. Falling behind the baseline or going slower speed to the baseline, we'll call it deceleration. Let's not stand on ceremony. The goal is to finish stuff faster, whatever stuff that is that we define it. That's how I approach it in the book. Basically be as practical as possible. Remember, the book was written not to produce a book. Like mine and Micah's job isn't writing books. The book was produced to eventually be able to train large swathes of AI how to look out for acceleration opportunities. So it really is just the practical techniques that you can use to look at acceleration in projects and how you measure it. Practical being the key term. If it's not implementable, it's pointless, it's worthless. And I said this to someone the other day. If it's not implementable, it's actually worth less than zero because it's cost you money and time to actually make it. Okay.
Amazing.
With that
was
we've come
the
up on
question.
time, Brooke.
Yes. All right. You can go ahead and close it out.
Right, well, all I want to say is I want to thank everyone that's been a part of making this. All I want to say for everyone who's on the call is please give us feedback. Please tell us what you think of the book. Up to now, we've only had positive comments back with people saying, one person called it a masterpiece, which I thought was incredibly generous. But generally people have said it's the most interesting thing they've read in the last decade, just because it addresses directly their profession in a completely different way that they're thinking about it. And the only thing I hope from this is that it makes people think a little differently about what they do. And if anybody has any questions or needs any help, Micah and I are here. You just have to reach out to us in some way, either LinkedIn or email, and we'd be happy to help. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.